Chapter 34. The afterlife was far different than Seer imagined. It was pain, terrible pain, and an inability to speak, to relieve it in any way. This is worse than life. An unjust reward for fighting so hard, for having to leave my mate behind. He tumbled through swirling colors, praying for a second death to take away his misery, for anything that would ease his suffering. When he finally opened his eyes, he was in a healing bed. He pressed his knuckles into his mouth and bit down on his scream. A second later, a shadow hovered above his bed, and the golden particles sparked with blue light. Finally. The edge of the pain dulled. The tightness in his chest eased and he could breathe. His hand fell back, and he pressed his body into the bed. How am I still alive? But he couldn't voice the question, so no answer came. He drifted in and out of consciousness, knowing somewhere in the back of his mind that his injuries must have been extremely severe to keep him completely unaware of the outside world. It told him that they were still afraid that any reprieve from the healing and pain medicine would be more than he could bear. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when he blinked and became aware of his body, and that other than a dull ache, he felt better. When he tried to sit up, soft hands helped him. His head spun as he fully sat up and his neck strained in protest. Then he opened his eyes, and she was there. Kaci's arms came around him, and he held her close. His chest felt tight as emotions overwhelmed him. She was here, she was safe, and they were together.
How do you feel?
Her voice was overjoyed. He breathed in the sweet scent of her hair and brushed his shaggy beard against her head. He cleared his throat as the word came out a croak. Okay. She pulled back and held his face in her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks.
I thought I'd lost you.
Someone cleared his throat behind them. It was Elder Medic Solemn.
Glad to have you back, Medic Seer.
He nodded at the old man, knowing he could have been the only one responsible for saving his life. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't have done it without your fierce little mate. She protected you until I got there and stood as my guard throughout your healing.
Somehow I'm not surprised to hear that. He looked at his beautiful mate. Of course you fought for me. The old man cleared his throat.
I hate to tell you this, but the council wants to see you right away. They've been waiting for you to gain consciousness so they can sort out this mess.
Seer nodded and struggled to stand.
You've got to be kidding me.
Kaci's mouth pulled into a tense line.
What he needs is rest.
The old man held up his hands.
I agree, but I'm not the one who makes the rules.
Whoever makes the rules is an idiot. Is it that bunch of old guys who stood around while Seer was dying? Isn't this whole thing their fault? They're the government.
It's okay, Seer reassured his passionate mate, although inwardly he felt amazed. No one has come to my defense before. I'll be fine. When he stood, it was only her soft arms around his waist that kept him from falling for the first few seconds. He leaned on her, then got his balance and started toward the door, but paused as he reached Medic Solemn. Leader and Gallant, did they make it? The old man nodded.
Leader's been in his mate's private medroom since he awoke, and Gallant is already back with his mate. They both wanted to be notified when you woke. I've already informed them.
Seer cleared his throat around the lump that had formed. The pregnant mother really must have been watching over us. I'll have to visit them when this is settled.
Hell, I think we all need a drink.
Solemn agreed. Whether we are all celebrating or consoling one another. Is the council still on this vessel or back on their ship?
They're still here in the fourth floor boardroom, questioning everyone and generally making life difficult.
Solemn shook his head.
Bureaucrats.
When they arrived at the boardroom, the guards at the door scrambled to let them in. Inside, 5 council members crowded around one end of the table. Dozens of holoscreens were scattered on the tabletop. The expressions on the faces ranged from anger to dismay. When Councilman Trustworthy looked up and saw them, he swept a hand through the screens and they disappeared. Seer, how are you? Kaci lowered him into a chair while he held back a groan. Alive. She seated herself next to him. taking his hand in her smaller one. Every eye in the room locked onto their clutched hands. She stared straight back at them, a challenge in her eyes. She wants them to know we're together. Does that mean she'll choose to remain with me? Councilman Trustworthy sighed.
It seems at least some of the rumors we heard are true.
Sear's face was impassive as he nodded, and I don't regret a moment of it. The older man sat in a chair and the others followed suit. He leaned back, steepling his hands together.
There are few males I respect as much as you.
I feel the same. And he did. Every interaction he'd had with Councilman Trustworthy had shown that. The man might not always rule in the way Sear thought was right, but his ruling always seemed unbiased and just.
But I must still make a decision based on our laws, do you understand?
I do. Tension sung through the air.
We understand that circumstances have since changed. But is it true that you, as a second-tier male, selected a mate?
Yes. The other males stiffened, but the councilman pressed on.
And you knew that such a thing was forbidden to you?
Yes.
And did you share a bed with this female?
Sear didn't hesitate. He didn't regret the truth, and would not lie no matter the cost. Yes. One of the men shook his head, muttering with disgust, but every expression grew angry.
And you also knew this was against our most sacred laws?
Yes. Trustworthy frowned, pausing for far too long.
And you joined a crew of males who stole brides from a primitive world?
Yes. Kaci suddenly stood.
You can't possibly get the full story with these questions. He didn't know we were being kidnapped. If you would just...
It's okay. He touched her arm gently. This is how it is done.
This is not Sear's fault.
She broke in, her voice overwhelmed with emotion.
The two of us falling in love and becoming mates wasn't about him being able to shift, or deserving me, or anything else. It is that we're meant to be together.
Councilman Precise wrinkled his large nose.
If the female cannot obey the rules of this meeting, she is not welcome.
But...
Sear squeezed her hand. Please, sit down. He motioned to the chair and said gently, We must respect the process of law. Very slowly, she sat. The tension in the room eased ever so slightly. Councilman Trustworthy smoothed the fabric of his white robe, and then leaned forward, his gaze locking with Sear's.
Is it true that you were the one to alert the Council of Parsimon's misdeeds and ask for assistance for the females, regardless of the consequences to yourself?
Yes.
And that you fully shifted to protect this female when she was being attacked by the Bortrax?
Yes. A murmur went through the observers. The councilman shook his head, obviously in disbelief.
Shifting for the first time as an adult. It's unexpected to say the least.
However,
a second councilman broke in.
we are grateful that you were able to shift. Otherwise, Parsimon would have gotten away with this travesty.
The first councilman's gaze turned to Kaci. Is it true that Medic Seer never once forced his affections on you?
He saw her eyes lighten with hope.
That's true.
And you willingly chose him as your mate, even though he was of a lesser status?
Yes.
And is it true that you will accept him as your mate, remaining with him forever of your own free will?
Seer couldn't breathe. This might be her chance to escape, to return to her old life and put this whole ordeal behind her. Would she actually choose him over returning to her world?
Yes.
She said, turning to face him.
Nothing would make me happier.
She smiled. His heart surged with joy at her words. Now all they have to do is say yes. He threw an arm around her and began to pray silently. Please, pregnant mother, if I ask you for nothing else, let me have this. Let me have her. The councilman nodded formally.
Please step outside. We shall make our decision.
They were in the hall for nearly an hour before they were called back in. Sear's legs shook and his eyelids felt heavy from the effort, but he held himself tall for their verdict, meeting each of their gazes, daring them to take his mate from him. Councilman Trustworthy stood, his expression unreadable.
Your crime is twofold. For one, you and your crew are responsible for damage to a primitive world and to precious female lives. Although you were unaware of the consequences of your actions, many were hurt because of your ignorance and complicity. Others were killed. Your second offense was to claim a female as a second-tier male and take her as your own. These crimes cannot be ignored.
Sear scanned the faces of the other councilmen, but their faces were impassive. The councilman took a deep breath.
You are henceforth stripped of any and all association with the Bride Initiative. You may never again take any role in this organization, nor are you allowed to leave the Spiritus without express consent of this council. What's more, since you have now been elevated to a first-tier male, effective immediately, you are solely responsible to see to the care and well-being of your mate, henceforth referred to as Kaci of the humans. Because of her unique health concerns, again a consequence of you and the other males associated with this disastrous kidnapping, it will be your responsibility alone to ensure she remains healthy. These responsibilities will be for the remainder of your life.
You mean
Kaci began. He held up a hand.
Additionally, here, today, before the council, we declare Kaci your bride, a union that can never be broken.
His lips curved into a slight smile.
Do you accept the decision set forth by the council, or wish to claim the rule unjust and seek the king's word on the matter?
Sear shook himself. Tears formed at the back of his eyes, but he blinked them away. His chest swelled, and even though it hurt to breathe, even to move, he struggled to his feet and met each of their gazes. His answer came out choked but clear. I do.
Then place her hand in yours and repeat after me.
He turned to his mate. Her own eyes glittered with tears, even as a smile curved her perfect lips. He repeated the mating words in a daze, his heart pounding with exhilaration. I, Sear, will love, cherish, and put my bride above me in all things for the remainder of our lives. Councilman Trustworthy turned to Kaci.
Do you accept this male as your mate until the end of your days?
I do.
He nodded.
Then, henceforth, Kaci and Sear will be one in the eyes of the law and the council.
Kaci threw herself into his arms and he pressed his face into her hair, inhaling her sweet, familiar scent. None of it had truly sunken in yet. Kaci was his mate, forever. If he awoke now, this moment would still be the best one of his life. He gazed over her head at the men who watched him. Thank you. Councilman Trustworthy smiled.
Oh, and the king wanted me to tell you that he is glad you survived and wishes to meet your mate. After your claiming period, of course.
As Kaci led him from the room, he couldn't keep the smile from his face. Now the rest of our lives will begin.